This time, Thames Valley Royals. Maxwell doesn't get the picture.
No, nay, never. No, nay, never, no more. 'Cause I'll stay a wild rover forever and more.
Hello and welcome to By Far the Greatest Team, a podcast in which football fans attempt the seemingly impossible to work out once and for all who is the greatest football team of all time. My name's Dunn, an Oxford United fan, but had things gone another way, I would also have had some interest in Reading under the great banner of Thames Valley Royals, who we're going to be talking about tonight. And joining me in our data corner is a man who would also, potentially, his team would also have ended up in Robert Maxwell's portfolio had Martin Edwards not been standing firm. It's Jamie Rooney.
Graham, nothing short of the end of the earth will prevent us from debating and ranking the Thames Valley Royals tonight. A team that does not exist, but we're still going to plough on. And yeah, you're right. Maxwell could have been, if it wasn't for Ron Atkinson adding $5 million to the price tag on a post-match interview after United just scored 5 goals past, I can't remember who it was now, I think it might have been Newell or something like that. Yeah, Maxwell could have been in there, but the $5 extra million of Ron Atkinson added on saved United. So great saviour. The portrait you have behind you, Ron Atkinson, saved United from Maxwell. Fortunately, we've never had any problems with owners since then.
No. I mean, who'd have thought that Robert Maxwell and Michael Knighton wouldn't have been the worst people who could possibly have bought Man United over the years? But there you go.
Indeed.
Because we are talking about Robert Maxwell. We're going back to 1983. If anyone's in any doubts of, this is right in our the centre of our football interest, early 80s and so forth. If I haven't alienated enough people with my Maxwell rather than Maxwell, get the picture video tagline reference in the opening. I'm also wearing the Oxford United 85-86, a very faded. There's technically yellow, and you can barely make out Wang computers along here. But
and indeed, at the shirt prompt, you just reminded me again. My apologies. I've just noted, and I know we're going to try to put these on our YouTube channel, so just so it's staying on my t-shirt. I'm just going to change. 1 second. Sorry, mate. Sorry about that.
Very good. Very good. That is very impressive.
I figured if we're going to be ranking teams that don't exist, I'm going to make football kits that don't exist. So yeah, good sponsorship as well.
Yeah, Daily Mirror, Admiral. I like it. This is good.
Yeah, actually, Reb, for those of our listeners who are listening in black and white, and they need to know where the green ball is behind the yellow ball, it may be worth describing what costume change I've just made.
So, Jamie, you have drifted into the sort of an amalgam of the Oxford Reading style of kit. I like the badge there. So, yeah, very, very impressive. Yeah.
TVR, Thames Valley Royals, sponsored by the Daily Mirror, obviously. Mm-hmm. Blue and yellow hoops, and of course, it can only be Admiral as the kit manufacturer.
I like that going the extra. There's not enough yellow in there, of course, but this was one of the key debates for the whole issue. Definitely the whole issue. The shirts I've got on, if you wanted another sign that we were of a certain age, I was playing a game of five-a-side. This was about 10 years or so ago, and I was on the lights versus the dark, so I dusted down the old Oxford United away kit. And in the change room, I realised that not only was I older than everyone else, but that my shirt was actually older than 4 of the other players. It's not a good sign, is it?
It's not the greatest sign, but my perspective of your shirt, the Oxford United shirt you've got on with the 2 kind of blue bits that come from the top of the shoulder down, when you lean forward, it looks like you're wearing braces. So from the same era, you're only fairly black perm away from being Bobby Ball from Cannon and Ball fame.
Well, yes, definitely so. Glorious days.
I will add for those that are listening, we do intend to put all of our podcasts onto our YouTube channel, which will launch during this season 3, if it hasn't already. So you will get a chance to mock the rubbish kits that we are wearing. Those of us that have bought them many, 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 many years ago, and those of us who've got too much time on our hands and make them in their own kitchen.
It's very impressive. I'm very impressed. Yeah, so this is the second in our sort of themed series of pre-season friendlies, which are it's loosely based around teams that don't exist or didn't exist. Last week, of course, we did the GB Olympics team, which does exist but sort of doesn't exist at the same time. Today we're going to be talking about the great Thames Valley Royals, who actually came sort of close to existing but didn't. And next week we're going to be doing an exciting one. We're going to be doing a Euro 2024 Barbarians team. We're going to attempt to put together a team that could beat the teams who are out there. So we're assembling an excellent cast for that, and we're working on our teams as we speak. So we've got a few sites that don't exist, but today's one we're really looking around mergers, and in the research for this, we'll come on a bit later on some of the other mergers that have been kicking around out there. But mergers is really, I mean, in the very early days, it was pretty commonplace, but you don't get many of them now, do you?
No, it's something that doesn't really happen, and for reasons I think that we're going to potentially debate and call out. But in the English football world, it did happen in the early days of our team. So, Stoke City, famous Stoke City, were created as a merger between Stoke Ramblers. I guess they liked a bit of walking. And Stoke Victoria, maybe that was the cake version. So you had the Walkers and the Cake Eaters that merged to create Stoke City in 1878. In town, they were a merger of Luton Town Wanderers. So clearly, Luton Town Wanderers didn't have a home, and Excelsior in 1885. And then the M1 derby, the seeds were sown in the late 1990s when Watford, West Hertfordshire, merged with Watford St Mary's, which sounds like a church team, I think, in 1898. And therefore, the M1 derby was able to exist many, many years later. But my favourite one, going back into the archives, is when Newcastle East End were having some financial difficulties, and their friends across the road, Newcastle West End, offered the olive branch to merge, and they became Newcastle United. Whatever happened to that team?
I assumed they were going to be called Newcastle Arsen, but there you go. So we are going back to the 80s, and I mean, this is essentially a story really about Robert Maxwell. We'll come on to him in plenty of parts, but I thought it'd be quite useful just to set in context what was happening to Oxford and Reading at that time, because for people following football now, it's probably a bit difficult to understand and really get a grip on that. These two Thames Valley giants were both kicking around in the third tier of football. So Oxford United, they spent the last couple of seasons on the edges of the third tier promotion race, and they were desperately looking around for a new ground. And Reading were in some horrendous financial peril and were on the brink of getting relegated to the bottom tier of the Football League. Now, fortunately, of course, this is very different from how things are now with Oxford, who have rather ruined my narrative by actually getting promoted out of the division. And it's interesting, but back in then, Oxford were in the ascendancy and Reading were a bit in the descending down the leagues, and actually Oxford a good 80s, and then pretty much that hasn't happened again until the last couple of years, when Reading have managed to find arguably the worst owner any of us have had, and have plummeted down, and Oxford have finally got going in the right direction. But in 1983, the reason they're going in the right direction is because a year earlier, Robert Maxwell had come to the party and had rescued Oxford from financial ruin and bankruptcy, and he was sort of a white knight for Oxford for a bit, in some way.
Just on that point, and not to jump ahead too much, it must be quite conflicting being an Oxford United fan with Robert Maxwell, because this really opens up the debate. Is there any such thing as good or bad behaviour? He just did a bunch of behaviour. Some of it the fans really liked, some of it the fans didn't really like. But he definitely got involved in the football club, and he had ambition. As you kick this piece off at the beginning, I think, potentially this stems because his nose was put out of joint because Oxford City Council wouldn't sell a plot of land for him to build a new stadium. And maybe he could have built a stadium with four ends, four sides.
Very much so. Well, it is. It's a very sort of conflicted period, and it is weird. I mean, it's obviously, it is the most successful period in Oxford's history, and Rob Maxwell was front and centre of that. He was a man not shy of publicity. He would be on the pitch at the end of, I still remember him being on the old manor turf, walking around with the Milk Cup trophy after our glory, and after we'd stayed up gloriously that year as well. So, he wasn't a hideaway in the background chairman in any way whatsoever. Maxwell is a fascinating character. I mean, I had forgotten that he was kind of a Labour MP for 6 years or so in the 60s. And sort of, tried again in the 70s as well. A successful businessman in many ways. I mean, there are definitions of successful. I think, given what happened in the end, and maybe not that successful, but certainly a high-profile businessman and a character who everyone kind of is familiar with. I was really struck when I was thinking about this. So, there's quite a regular character who appears, and you're seeing it still now, even with Succession, with a character very similarly based on Rupert Murdoch. But throughout kind of my newer lifetime, there have been a huge number of characters who are amalgams of somewhere between Rupert Murdoch and Robert Maxwell as these media moguls, cast as, clearly as people who, are ruthless, people building these empires, people who like a bit of the attention as well. I think that's definitely the Robert Maxwell way. And I was struck that when I was thinking about this, there's a couple of... So Robert Hardy, who's sort of probably best known as Siegfried from All Creatures Great and Small, but he plays two characters remarkably similar to Robert Maxwell. One in a comedy series called Hot Metal, where he plays both the editor and the publisher of the Daily Crucible, this tabloid paper, and the publisher character is what is constantly getting them to put stories about him with glamorous models in the main paper, which seems remarkably similar. And then there's an episode of Inspector Morse where Robert Hardy plays a Eastern European originating bullying business megalomaniac. Again, with a lot of similarities to Robert Maxwell. So I'm trying to think why Robert Maxwell was known. Was it for football or was it beyond?
Yeah, and just to kind of fill it out, I mean, just on Robert Hardy, I absolutely loved Robert Hardy. No, for me, Minister of Magic in the Harry Potter movies, absolutely. That's as well. And then he did that when he was like in his late 70s and 80s, and he still looked like a spring chicken. Absolutely fantastic actor. But yeah, Maxwell as well, just to go back, he's originally from Czechoslovakia. His family and him, they escaped the Nazis. When the Nazis, he comes from Jewish origin. He escaped the Nazis, fled across France, fought in the Second World War, became a captain, won the Military Cross. So, he's a hero in these kind of realms of, these guys that have done brave and crazy things. So the fact that he's trying to do very brave and crazy things in 1983 with Oxford United and Reading is no great surprise when you look back in the chronicles of Robert Maxwell's history.
Absolutely. And in fact, the Czech thing comes in. There's a really bizarre thing that happens when he's at Derby, where he essentially tries to sign two defecting Czech footballers. You can sort of essentially sign them for free. He presents them at a press. They never get to play for Derby at all. And in the end, they go back to the Czech sides. So there's all sorts of weird stuff going on. So, but he he's come in. He rescues Oxford, and that begins a very successful period. And what's not in question about Robert Maxwell, when he was first in charge of teams, he would certainly invest in them. That Oxford side is definitely on the rise. They're, mounting a pretty decent promotion campaign. Jim Smith is at the helm of the club by then. So they're going well. Reading, by contrast, are sort of struggling, even though they've got the free scoring Kerry Dixon in their side, and they spend most of that year battling away just outside the relegation places. They know they're in a bit of a scrap. But what I think is brilliant about this story is it just emerges super casually overnight. Well, not even overnight. It just kind of happens. There's a documentary that Radio Oxford made, and I'd point people to, if they want to hear more kind of first-hand accounts of this, the Oxford United Dub podcast recently re-aired that episode. They made it at 30 for the 30th anniversary, but it's got some brilliant first-hand accounts, including John Lay, who was the Oxford Mail sports reporter on the time, and he was the guy who got the call from someone at the Telegraph saying, I think something's going on with Oxford and Reading, and so he checks it out with Jim Smith, and Jim's what's all this about? And Jim Smith rings Robert Maxwell to check whether, as you say, he in fact still has a job at the end of this. It finds out that it is confirmed. It confirms that he has a job, and then sort of announce. And this is, it's difficult to know. Maybe something's lost in the nuance, but it does appear initially as though Jim Smith has something of a David Brent moment where he kind of announces to the players. This is on a Saturday, it's on a game day. It's when they're playing Doncaster. Before the game, announces them David Brent style. The great news: there's going to be a merger, and I'm going to be manager. To which the players, I think, probably then reads through, because the players suddenly think, "Hang on, two teams coming together? They're not going to meet." And if you're sort of the third or fourth choice centre back, suddenly you're looking like you're the seventh or eighth choice centre back, and you haven't got a club anymore.
I would just absolutely love the way that Jim Smith has just reduced himself down to the common denominator of just self-preservation in the most desperate moments. We're all guilty of it. And I mean, he's actually crazy when he's learning it. It's just like, your first thought is, do I have a job? So he's only thinking about himself. And yeah, his David Gray moment is absolutely fantastic. But he's absolutely 100% in self-preservation mode. Also, I mean, as you can talk through the detail, it all happens quite quickly, and it's all happening behind closed doors. And I think most fans, and we should mention as well, from a Reading perspective, there's a podcast called the 1871 podcast, the Reading podcast. They did a 40th anniversary on this as well, where the people on the podcast were actually part and can remember everything that's going on. And equally, just like Oxford United fans, they were outraged and against the idea completely. And we do everything in the possible power to stop it from happening. But I think news broke on Grand Slam. I think it was to the fans. I think David Coleman, as a footnote in Grand Slam, just said, and quite remarkable news coming in here, that Oxford United and Reading will merge for the 1983-1984 season as Thames Valley Royals. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, and that was that. And if you weren't particularly invested in the club, and at the time I was still quite young, I didn't join the Oxford Glory bandwagon for another couple of years, so I was a Liverpool fan at that stage, which I fortunately turned my back on. But I think my reaction was the same as lots of people's. The chief thing about it was the name. Thames Valley Royals just sounded so awful and so, but not a football club name.
I just think it's classic of the type of character Robert Maxwell was when it came to just understanding what football was, and in particular what English football meant to the fans of the club. I just don't think he understood it. And his logic is, I think it's just simple logic. There's two teams. Yeah. They both play in Thames Valley. So we're just calling the Thames Valley Royals, Thames Valley United potentially, and we'll just draw a line and we'll build a new ground in the middle of both of them, and everything will be hunky-dory, and we'll bubble our gate receipts, we'll go on, and I think he's kind of in this era in the 90s and the 70s where mergers and acquisitions are incredibly popular in the business world, and in the late 80s we see films like the Pretty Woman and The Secret of My Success, where they're about mergers and acquisitions, and I think Maxwell's come from that world. And he's just completely misunderstood that you cannot apply that process to football. It just doesn't work. Football is way more complex. It's way more tribal. It's way more emotional. You can't run football in the sense of running your big banks and manufacturing businesses where you just kind of bring two alien companies together to maximize its growth.
Absolutely. Interestingly, it was Thames Valley Royals was the initial one, and then the Oxford side, there was anger about the idea. Apart from anything else, kind of Thames Valley was sort of the area, but isn't particularly Oxford and Royals is the Reading thing. So Maxwell said, call it Thames Valley United. If they're going to complain, let's call it Thames Valley United, as if that was going to make the difference. That's not the only problem.
He ran a competition whereby if the fan could come up with the winning name that was chosen, the fan will have a season ticket for life or something. Thinking again, this is a brilliant prize. Who wouldn't want to participate in this? He's just not reading the room. He just doesn't have his finger on the pulse of what English football is at this particular moment.
And this whole approach, you're absolutely right. It's a businessman's approach. You've got two underperforming businesses, and there's no question Oxford were in massive financial trouble before he arrived. Reading remained in dramatic financial problems there. So you've got two underperforming businesses, merge them together. That makes absolute sense. So, Maxwell didn't understand that business in any way whatsoever and and on top of that, you've got Maxwell, whose approach to business was probably came from a sort of a more, would be polite to say, more bullying kind of style. It's certainly hard-nosed kind of business, and would sort of trample all over stuff, and not used to people saying no. You certainly wouldn't have expected unpopularity and resistance. You've touched upon it there. The stadium is everything. Oxford were desperately looking to try and leave. A brilliant ground, though, was the Manor Ground. They just couldn't make the finances work. No kind of corporate boxes and no corporate entertainment of any kind, I don't think. There were some yellow seats. That was about it. So, they were looking to make the move. They were looking to do that. He was getting no joy with a new stadium. Not the only person to have struggled to find, and it's quite difficult to build a stadium in Oxford. And throughout this, whatever his motives were, there's definitely a thought that, well, if they won't build a stadium there, we'll go and form another club and build a stadium halfway between the two. And Didcot, I think, was one of the places they were looking at. And it just, and you mentioned it. There's the thing that you could have 6,000 fans from one, 6,000 fans the other, combine together, you get 12,000 or whatever the numbers were, and actually you get far less.
He just doesn't understand any of it. He really doesn't. I mean, even if we go back to the name Thames Valley Royals, they have a beautiful kit, by the way. It's fun, manufactured by Admiral, a really nice kit. But the name doesn't even make it. If you look at the top 4 or 5 divisions now in English football, and it's always been this case, teams generally come from a town, a city, a district, a borough. There's some kind of identity behind where the people who follow that football team live and have worked their lives, most of their lives. Valley Royal is Thames Valley. I don't even know. I know it's far-reaching as Oxford and London, and it covers the Thames, but it's not. I don't think it's an official region. And I think the only football team I can think of, other than Arsenal, where there's some debate whether, Arsenal is a place, but Arsenal has become a place in London, the same way that White City became a place in London when White City Stadium was built for the 1908 Olympics, as we discussed before. The only team I can think of is Port Vale, who there is no such place as Port Vale in Stoke. So the name, he's got it wrong. And yeah, absolutely. The proximity of the stadium is just ridiculous, because I've got some numbers here. So Oxford, around about 1983, has a population of 135,000 people, give or take. They have an average attendance of around about 8,000 at that time. Reading have a population of around 205,000 in 1983. They've got an average attendance of 4,000 at Elm Park. So, you could do the maths there. There's not a lot of people in those regions, in those towns where the football club exists, and going to games. Cot, as you mentioned, was a possible location. They already had a football team called Didcot Town playing in the Hellenic League, which is secretary of the pyramid. They were getting on average around about 100 to games. They got a population of 20,000. So his logic was, if we put it in the middle, he just assumes that the 8,000 from Oxford and the 4,000 from Reading would travel to Didcot and watch this new team. And it doesn't work that way. And I could build on the example. I've got some Milton Keynes Dunn, the best probably example you can have in terms of relocation. I've got some numbers that absolutely support that I can bore you with as well, in terms that his logic is absolutely flawed from the very beginning.
So clearly what happens is the two fans groups mobilize. They both launch SOS campaigns. Now, British football fans a love-hate relationship with the word soccer. So soccer is quite convenient for when you need a save our soccer. Or in Oxford, it was save our soccer for Reading. In Oxford's case, it was save Oxford soccer. There's an objection to soccer from most. I mean, nobody would call it soccer. But it's...
Great, so it's my apologies. Which again is another failure on Maxwell's part. He's absolutely missed the rivalry. Clearly, you can't even agree on what you're going to call the campaign as teams. What chance have you got to coexist?
This is true. Yeah, I think they were pretty much separate, spontaneous. But we don't like this, and we don't like this. I think there's a bit of common ground. It's worth saying, of course, that Maxwell had already bought 19% of Reading on top of what he had from Oxford, and he claimed to have the irrevocable support of the Reading directors and shareholders and board. This becomes a thing thanks to some great work from Roger Smee. But so he claims to have that, and he claims to have the support from the FA as well. And
from what I've learned from this, I'm not so sure the FA did support it. I think they just did what the FA did at the time and didn't question it. I think they were just kind of watching it with interest, was the quote. Therefore, they were doing nothing. They were neither supporting it or neither supporting the fans against it, which I think was typical of the Football Association and has been for a long period of time. Just trying not to get involved in such matters where potentially they can lay out governance in these matters. Because you're right. Maxwell's got controlling interest in Oxford United, and he's got 19% of Reading, and he's also got bits of Derby, and he's trying to get bits of Watford as well. And regulations didn't exist at the time that prevented him from buying up as many football teams as he wants.
No, absolutely. He's got he will come on to the Derby and Watford part. But yeah, as far as he's concerned, he said, well, they'll play out the season as they are, and then they'll start the next season as Thames Valley Royals. It all said with fabulous certainty. And when you kind of hear him sort of talking about it, what's the... I don't understand. What's the fuss? Why is everyone... I don't really understand what's the objection. I mean, it's just brilliant. And obviously there is a massive objection. And, it's perfectly scripted that the Reading should play Oxford shortly after that game. They play at the start of May, which Reading get the win. But, there are protests around the games. There are protests throughout. No one could be in any doubt what the depth of feeling from the supporters is around this. It is the Reading side where what's interesting is, I think there would have been bigger challenges ahead that they probably wouldn't have got to. So I don't think you can say this wasn't a fans' revolt. It wasn't the fans that won this. But obviously, what actually causes the deal to break down is some pretty disastrous stuff on the part of the Reading directors, and some brilliant kind of detective work by Roger Smee, a former Reading player who had already been interested in buying the club from Jack Waller, I think it is, who's the Reading chairman at the time. Reading in a pretty perilous situation, and it's quite a long, complicated story. But I think, in short, Smee sort of thinks, well, this is interesting. How can they have irrevocable support for this when I don't think they own the majority of the club? And what essentially been happening, they kind of published, I don't know, they're phantom shares, but they produced more shares, and these didn't really apply to anything. And then he successfully challenged this. These shares didn't exist, and that actually the Reading shareholders didn't own the enough of it to hand the club to Maxwell. This then forced Maxwell to, as you would in business, to make we'll make an offer. We'll buy it anyway. We'll buy it off you anyway. To which it was rejected, and Smee put together a separate package, and the deal was crushed.
I mean, it's great work from Roger Smee, a local businessman at that particular time. It's obviously getting back into the days where professional footballers didn't have a lot of money, and Roger Smee would have been a lower league footballer. So he had become a business owner and developer in Reading, and obviously had an interest in buying the club, as you mentioned, Graham. But he's got an interest, but it goes literally to the wire, isn't it? I think it's the classic kind of our save from Roger Smee, because Maxwell and his cronies have organised a press conference in April. I mean, this is weeks after they've announced it's going to happen. Both Oxford United and Reading as football clubs will be dead from the 83-84 season, and in its place will be Thames Valley Royals playing in the third tier of the English pyramid. So Roger Smee works incredibly well to get the right legal means in place to stop that press conference at the 11th hour.
And then he ends up in this slightly surreal situation where he does gain control of Reading, but Maxwell refuses to sell his 19% stake and remains a shareholder, who I imagine didn't make life very easy for Smee there, at least until Maxwell gets sidetracked with other interests. I think what's interesting, we talked about it a bit about it, and I think this to some extent comes through, when we're talking about Jim Smith, is actually there is no question that Jim Smith would be manager. You had Maurice Evans, who was manager of Reading at the time. He'd been manager for a fair while, and Maurice Evans leaves the following season anyway. Ultimately, obviously, becomes chief scout at Oxford and then takes over from Jim Smith. But he'd be hugely reluctant the entire time he is manager of Oxford United. He doesn't want to be. He kind of needs persuading and badgering to take the job. So, I think in terms of the management, there probably wasn't much question. But Jim Smith was a sort of high-profile manager. I mean, he goes on to be highly successful there, but he had been in Birmingham before, lost his job when Ron Saunders left Villa, highly successful Villa manager, and replaced him there. So I think that was always going to happen. But also you have, I think from the Oxford side, there's the one of the famous quotes that Smith gives in the, I think Smith is said in the dressing room is, once he detects that the players are slightly worried about their future careers, he goes, "Oh no, it's just a way of us buying Kerry Dixon, and you'll all still be playing for us," which is probably not true. But it's obviously difficult to go back to 1983 and really do a proper analysis of which players would have made the cut if you were to get a make one squad or one squad out of those teams. But it's definitely true that the Oxford side who go on to have a lot of success, there's the spine of that team is there. So Briggs and Shotton at the back, and Trevor Hebbard, who is such a star of the Milk Cup final, and Kevin Brock and George Lawrence and Steve Hardwick and Andy Thomas. So they're all in that squad. They will go on the journey with Oxford up the leagues. And on the Reading side, you have Kerry Dixon, who goes on and outshines everyone with a glorious career for Chelsea in England after he gets sold in the summer. But other than that, there's not a huge number of people that I can see went on from that Reading side. So Laurie Sanchez is probably the next most famous name, but he obviously works his way up the leagues with Wimbledon. And then there's Alan Judge, the goalkeeper, who ironically joins Oxford and eventually takes Steve Hardwick's place for the cup final. So, I think there is an element to it. Whilst, I think Jim Smith was probably a throwaway line at the time, I think there is an element whereby if you are in the Oxford dressing room, you are probably more confident of being the acquisitor rather than the company being purchased. And so maybe there's a bit more sort of confidence. And I think you are not seeing this as a 50-50 merger because, Robert Maxwell owns one club already. So that probably, maybe there's an element in that, which...
There's also some statistical proof in this because Oxford are competing with Jim Smith at the top end of the table while Reading are battling at the bottom end of the table. So they're in the same division, but they're at completely different ends. So I think, I do think Jim Smith was just, as you coined it brilliantly, having his David Brent moment. But for Jim Smith himself, I mean, he survives a short time and then obviously for him, he kind of goes into a bit of a decline himself at this point as well, doesn't he, really? I mean, he goes to QPR and famously QPR play Oxford in the Milk Cup final. And then after that, he kind of has a little bit of success at Derby, but nothing much more than that. So for Jim Smith, he's almost at the peak of his powers as a football manager. Would you say, or was that being unfair, Graham?
Yeah, well, obviously, I think the peak of his time was his 2 years at us. He goes on to manage Newcastle as well for a bit. He gets quite a few jobs without, and obviously, Southgate's Jamie would talk very fondly about Jim Smith taking a Portsmouth side to a cup semi-final with them, quite cruelly lost. So I think there's sort of more to it. It is interesting, Jim Smith. He leaves Oxford because he falls out with Robert Maxwell over a new contract after getting 2 promotions in a row. So, I think he knows it's gonna be a bit tumultuous with Maxwell one way or the other. It is, as you say, for Reading. So Oxford, I think they finished 5th that season. Reading actually go down that year. They sell Kerry Dixon as well. Continue a pretty successful run. They signed the free-scoring Trevor Senior, who scored absolute shed loads of goals until he joined Watford, and that didn't work out for him. And Reading do, within a couple of years, they begin a more sort of profitable journey. I mean, Smee is chairman for, I think, a couple of years, and then he sells to John Majewski, and, the journey begins, and they successfully move out of Elm Park and to a new stadium, go on to, one of their more successful periods. But Oxford obviously go on, and this is where there's a real challenge and contradiction in having Robert Maxwell as your owner, because, he has suggested doing, literally the worst thing that an owner could do. And then Oxford go on to have their most successful period ever under him, and his money definitely helped until, to some extent, Ron Maxwell's like that. That meme you see on the internet with the bloke who's walking through town with his girlfriend, and he's caught the eye of this other girl who's walked past. And so Oxford United is the girlfriend he's with. Derby County is the attractive young girl who's walked past that he's eyeing up. And then, within a couple of years, he's with Derby County. Oh, is that Watford walking around the corner? These are sort of, they would kind of play things for him. But you did end up in this extraordinary situation where, he owns, doesn't give up on the Oxford project. And it's worth mentioning, obviously, people who aren't familiar with it, there's an obvious connection as the reason why Robert Maxwell gets involved with Oxford, because he actually lives in Headington, where and Oxford United used to be Headington United, and that's the where the club played. And Pergamon Press, his first company before he bought the Mirror Group, was based in Headington. So there's a logic to local businessmen taking over, and there's some suggestion that actually his involvement with Oxford was kind of a way of gaining some support from workers. It's quite a popular thing to do with people in the region or in the city, and kind of helped with various attempts to in staff negotiations and bits and pieces like that.
Just to demonstrate his wealth at the time, it was Headington Hall, wasn't it, that he was renting?
Yes.
Didn't even own it. He was renting a stately home. And on this stately home, he would land and take off in his private helicopter to get to various parts of the UK. That was the ridiculous nature of his wealth at the time. But I maybe I'm a bit cynical, maybe I'm a bit simple. I think he used football as a vehicle to be a celebrity. I think he had the wealth, he had the profile. Obviously, he was running newspapers in the United Kingdom, and I think he fancied a bit of TV. I think he fancied a bit of the celebrity lifestyle, and I think football was that vehicle for him to get involved. Obviously, when one door shuts, he went to another football club to keep promoting Robert Maxwell as the brand.
Yeah, and he definitely likes the idea of being a saviour, being welcomed, and all these bits and pieces. So you definitely see within the first couple of years when he's at this club, at Derby, when he takes over there, he invests money, not quite as much as was possibly suggested. The $1 million he spent on Peter Shilton, there's a suggestion it's not quite as much as that in the extra transfer money, but they bought Peter Shilton and Mark Wright and Trevor Hebard. But of course, most infamously for Oxford fans, they bought Dean Saunders in a deal which, fair play to Mark Lawrenson, who was a manager at the time. Well, Oxford had been relegated after their 3-year stay in the top division, and there was supposedly a deal in place that, on agreement, that they wouldn't sell Dean Saunders to Derby County. or they wouldn't sell him. So they wouldn't sell Ian Saunders until the end of the season, depending on whether they got promoted or not. And in, I think, October of that season, he gets sold for $1 million to Derby County. Now, clearly, I mean, you don't get any of these shenanigans in football now with clubs being transferred between parent groups and bits and pieces. I mean, that, unfortunately, those days are over, but it definitely caused quite some challenges. And Mark Lawrenson, I think technically he basically walked out as appointed principal over that. But, at this point, Maxwell has interest in 3 clubs. He has full ownership stakes in Oxford, in Derby. He has minority stake in Reading. And it's only when he reaches an agreement to buy Watford off Elton John that the league finally decide, I just don't think this can carry on. And that's where the rule is in place. It's put in place that owners can't hold more than 2%, I think it is, of another English football club.
Yeah, protected Maxwell a little bit though, because he still was allowed to have his ownership, but couldn't go off buying. So I think the thing is a US rule that dates back to the 1800s called the grandfather rule, which is something I learned about through Maxwell's numerous ownerships of football teams. So he was kind of protected, but for all the right reasons, the FA had stepped in and put in some kind of legal structure that stopped custodians from abusing their power.
I won't get into Robert Maxwell's other financial operations. It's a well-known story. His challenges to the Mirror Group pension, and obviously his death in 1991. But the end of this is that, certainly for Oxford, I'm not 100% familiar with what the case was for Derby, but it left Oxford in financial ruin again. That's pretty much where they found him. And it's taken Oxford quite a long time to bounce back from that period, it has to be said. So that came close. I think my other favourite, or the most eye-catching football merger story or suggestion that I came across came even after that. So it's far, a much less developed idea. I'm not sure. Robert Maxwell's Thames Valley Royals is very developed, but this one certainly wasn't. So there was a supposed proposal. It was all a bit sort of played down by him, but Ian Stott, who was long-serving, very successful chairman of Oldham we covered Oldham Athletic in a previous podcast last year. Very successful. He was in charge of a very successful period of the club, but he had apparently proposed the idea of a 3-way merger between those other Manchester legends of Rochdale and Bury. So Oldham, Bury and Rochdale to merge and operate under the Manchester North End name. When news of this idea, I'm not sure how developed or not, leaked out, so that was the end of Ian Stott's reign. He basically had, the opposition, the people were so appalled that was it. He went, which again comes to your idea that even if something makes sense on paper, and on paper you look at those 3 teams, Rochdale, Bury and Oldham, none of whom are in the league today. Bury obviously had horrendous financial problems. Oldham pretty dire as well. So on a pure business level, maybe there is an argument that 3 teams instead of 1 would make more sense. But you just don't understand football, do you?
I just think it shows a complete disrespect for the football fan. It's almost a disregard for the football fan. It's just really misjudging what football is. I mean, football is this global game because of the demand, the attendances, the volume of people that obsess over the game and get involved in the game and want to watch the game. If football didn't have that, football is a minor sport that not many people get involved with, to not do a disservice to hockey, which came around about the same time as football. Football is hockey without the attendances. If hockey was getting 80,000 attendances all the time, hockey would be a major game like football, rugby league and rugby union, American football right now, but it doesn't. So I just think, the Robert Maxwell's, the Insta, they're just, their ideas on paper, as you say, Graham, in the context of survival. And generally these ideas of a merger come when football teams, or more than one football team, have financial problems. So they're looking for a way to survive. But you really need to take into consideration the football fan and how they feel about these things. And if you don't, you're setting yourself up for failure. But that is a good story. But I mean, there's two teams playing in the National League at the moment. You've got Dagenham and Redbridge, and you've got Solihull Moors. Now, both of those football teams are a result of a merger. Now, QPR absolutely have a history of possible mergers. In fact, Queen's Park Rangers are a merger in 1886 of Christchurch Rangers and St Jude's. I'm guessing it would have been community churches potentially that would have formed Queen's Park Rangers in West London. And Queen's Park Rangers themselves, with Jim Gregory, the chairman, in 1967, almost merged with Brentford. Now, Brentford had at the time, because Brentford were a top flight team in the 1930s, and as a result, they had a 40,000 capacity stadium. So the idea was that QPR, who were struggling at the time, could merge with Brentford. And again, you're looking at financial reasons why this was potentially proposed, but that one didn't happen. Fast forward 20 years, Jim Gregory, the same guy, is now part of a merger between West London rivals Fulham and Queen's Park Rangers. Now, a gentleman called David Strode has acquired both grounds, Loftus Road and Craven Cottage. Now, Craven Cottage, for those who know it, it's in one of the most idyllic parts of London. It's one of my favourite football grounds to go to. They've built a new stand on the bank of the River Thames now, so it's probably losing that kind of charm that it's always had, but it's still a beautiful football ground to go to. And the idea that David Bulstrode, through the developers, Mayor, would merge both football teams and would merge a team called Fulham Park Rangers. Therefore, Fulham would then play at Loftus Road, and Craven Cottage, that fantastic Archibald Leach Stadium, would be demolished and replaced with condominiums along the River Thames that would sell for many, many millions. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because one of our heroes we talked about in season 2, right at the end of season 2, Ginny Hill, a man of many talents, a man of many faces, he was able to garner enough support to raise the funds to buy Fulham from the developers, but he didn't have the money to buy the ground. As it turns out, David Bulstrode had a heart attack 18 months later and died in what would the red top newspapers would say controversial headlines. Now, we know that's never going to happen again.
Well, yeah, no, definitely so.
But it's worth pointing out, just so I can get a Manchester United reference, in the 1960s, there was a serious proposal that came from Manchester City to merge both United and City. As crazy as that may sound, that was something that was on the table. Now, it didn't happen, unfortunately, depending on your perspective, I guess. But yeah, the two giants of Manchester could have been Manchester Unity right now, and facing the Manchester North End in the Great Manchester Derby.
I'd love that. I love that idea. Yeah, it's surreal. You have, another probably successful, or one of the more recent successful mergers, or it would be Rushden and Diamonds. They merged in 92. It never really occurred to me that was a merger. So that's Rushden Town, I think it is, and they merged.
Borough, I think.
I'm glad you pronounced it. Yeah.
Borough.
Earthling-Bury. Diamonds.
Yes. Actually, that is a really good example where you bring out that, because Rushden and Diamonds, I think at the time when the two teams merged in 92, I think they were in about the 6th or 7th tier. And they went on a series of promotions in quite a quick, fast time. I think within 20 years, they were playing in not just league football, they were playing in the 3rd tier of league football. So that is really a success story of a football merger that's gone well. But it's probably the only one that we can think of, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's difficult to, if you're not particularly familiar with Rushden or from Earthing Borough, then you don't really know what the feeling is. I'm sure there were lots of people at both clubs who, really didn't like the idea and objected to the idea of it. But, because it's a relatively low profile club that goes on to bigger things, that's that you see that as more of a success. But it's a sort of fascinating world of mergers. But Russian and Diamonds had their moment in the sun and then returned back into non-league. We should probably wrap this one up. This was just going to be one of our short pre-season friendlies. The clock's ticked over an hour already.
No such thing these days.
I do feel like I should give a 10-minute section to point out what a legend Jim Smith is. He certainly, and don't worry, we will be doing that. The lasting memory of him as a David Brent is not going to be how we recognise an absolute hero. But we'll save that for the 86 FA Milk Cup winning side podcast, which has to come at some point soon. So we have 5 categories of greatness. We have all-time greats, true greats, touch of greatness, edge of greatness, blinkered great sport, not necessarily great, but without them we wouldn't be where we are today. I'm not sure where we are today, the Thames Valley Royals, because we're nowhere. Actually, no, it is clear, isn't it? Because it has to be without them we wouldn't be where we are today, because it is the closest that anyone has come to suggesting something mad. And there's probably 2 or 3 lessons from it. One is pick a better name. Definitely don't pick a silly name. Secondly, maybe have some sensitivity to what the local fans might think of this. Maybe some engagement with the fans ahead of just announcing it. And thirdly, just don't bother it. You're never going to be able to merge successful or even unsuccessful football clubs. Nobody wants to do it.
I totally agree. I think the lessons there are fantastic, and you can even link this story to what happened a couple of seasons ago, potentially with the big clubs in Europe wanting to go off and create their own Super League, and clearly they'd kind of hatched this plan. They hadn't tested the water, and the reaction to it was exactly predictable. But they seemed to be surprised. What, you're not for a Super League? What's there not about? Don't get it. Far more money than sense in some cases. But I completely agree. I don't think there is any other place to rank them. But I think it's probably worth talking through the legacy a little bit. Both teams did bounce back. Reading went down that season, did bounce back with a couple of successful promotions. They did go on and make their first appearance at Wembley in 1988 and won the Simod Cup, which was in use when English teams were unable to participate in European football. I think they knocked out a local rival en route to the final as well, if memory serves. And obviously Oxford, as we're going to talk about at some point, successful promotions. They became a top flight team, very exciting team. They won the Milk Cup. You know what? And if they wouldn't have got there, it could have been Thames Valley Royals versus Fulham Park Rangers in the final, with Jim Smith managing both teams. And that would have been an interesting quiz question. Also, the Virgin deniers are probably the best quiz question of all, which was, whilst Maxwell was going to be building this new ground, the clubs would rotate home matches between the Manor Ground and Elm Park every alternative home match, which robbed us of the best football quiz question of all time, which is the only football team to have ever played home games at 2 grounds in one season. 2 teams playing at the same ground, but not many times has a team played at 2 grounds.
Definitely, it's a case of split personalities there. So, Thames Valley Royals, not necessarily great, but without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. Excellent. That was a lot of fun. We didn't even talk about the New Saints. New Saints were among the are another successful merger, although I think that's probably, is that a merger or was that just more of an acquisition?
I think it's a merger and a relocation. That's what makes the New Saints really interesting. But with the greatest respect to the people of Clan Stanfred, it's a lot smaller scale than Oxford and Reading, which are, sizable cities in England. And Do you know what? I think it's fascinating that we can just talk about a team that didn't exist for so long and still have the same giddy enthusiasm we have when we're talking about the New Saints or any other team that we've covered on these podcasts. And I didn't get to share my Milton Keynes statistics. I feel robbed. I feel. Yeah, so I think I need to drop them in because part of the argument why this was not going to work was to use the MK Dons, which is slightly unfair because they are the kind of the kick-in vehicle for these situations.
Yeah.
Obviously, we all know the history that Wimbledon, and Wimbledon obviously became Milton Keynes Dons, but it was Ron Nodes in 1979 that sowed the seed of that idea. Ron Nodes, who was famous with Crystal Palace, was the owner of Wimbledon in 1979. And he actually bought Milton Keynes City, or Milton Keynes FC as it would have been, I think, for £1 in 1979. And he tried the relocation thing back then with Wimbledon. So the relationship with Wimbledon and Milton Keynes goes way back. I'm sure there's lots of Milton Keynes and Wimbledon fans that can talk us through that. But, Milton Keynes as a population now is almost 300,000. They have an attendance of, on average attendance, is 7,500. I mean, that's quite a lot. In a stadium that's over 30,000, by the way. And even when they were in the championship for that one season, they didn't get anything above 13,000. So they're not even half filling it. Wimbledon, who play at Plough Lane now, again, are getting around about 7,800. So Wimbledon getting more. At the time when Wimbledon were under pressure to leave Plough Lane, they were getting around 7,500. It's the same number. And obviously, when Wimbledon did get moved to Milton Keynes at the beginning, MK Dons as they were getting around about 3,500. So the idea that you're going to increase capacity in that one case example, it's just not the case. And anyone who thinks otherwise, I think is just deluding themselves. Football fans are fickle, but they're not that fickle. You can change your car, you can change your house, you can change your wife, but you can't change your football team.
This is definitely true. Definitely true. Wise words. Okay. We'll wrap it up there. So in one more of our pre-season friendlies to come, we're going to be next week. We're going to be talking about the Euro 2024 Barbarians, whatever that is. We'll see you again next week.